Well, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome everyone this afternoon for this talk on eating modernity, intersection of technology and tradition in the Indian kitchen. The talk is being given by Dr. Saumya Gupta. She is currently a fellow with us and she is also an associate professor of history at the Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. Her research focuses on critical food studies, partition studies, and urban social history. She has also been a co investigator for the AHRC GCRF International Project on Forgotten Food, Culinary Memory, Local Heritage, and Lost Agricultural Varieties in India 2019 to 2021, and the lead investigator for the ICSSR JSPS Indo-Japanese Bilateral Collaboration Research Project on ideas of food and body in India from medieval to contemporary times. So I extend a warm welcome to her. Um, the topic of she has already made one presentation on the subject of cookbooks, if I remember correctly, especially in North India. And so this is related to her research project, and now she is going to speak to us on how the food traditions in the period soon after independence were sought to be modernized. A kind of modern technology was sought to be introduced in the making of food, and changes were sought to be made and recommended by the state with regard to the ingredients of food and the cereals used, etc., etc. So how this food modernity was also seen as part of an overall movement towards modernity. I believe that is what she is going to talk about. So now, without further delay, I would like to invite her to proceed with her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra, and I really thank NMML for giving me this opportunity to present my work here. Also for the fellowship, which has been really, which has let me lead a pretty much stress-free past 2 years rather than not being in college. But I thank all of you also who have taken time out from your very busy schedules to come and listen. I have my teacher here, Professor Amin, so this is a great honor for me, so thank you to him also for coming. Just a brief overview of my project here before I begin at NMML, which has, as Dr. Mishra said, which has looked at transformations that have come in the North Indian diets over the past century and a half. So it starts by tracking, food in everyday settings. I've broadly divided the project into 4 sections. So, the first half is over 1870 to 1900, then the early decades of the 19th century, 20th century, then 1940 to 1980, and then 1990s to after that. And in this, I have looked at how colonial investigations into the diet of peasants, so my first entry, peasants and prisoners. Then I went over to Hindi cookbooks, which, as Dr. Mishra says, I've presented here. Today, I'm going to present on the section where, I'm looking at issues of food and hunger and nutrition during the early years of independence. And later on, lastly, there will be a my last chapter is going to be on issues of health and, how we are going back to a diet which is similar to what the peasants were eating in the late 19th century. So today's presentation in that sense tracks the entry of modernity and technology in Indian kitchens and how this impacted traditional eating, domestic cookings between 1950s to 1970s. I try to contextualize a move towards a technological approach to food production in the first 5 years of independence, when the state tried to deal with scarcity through rationing and austerity measures by imploring people to grow more food and to consume subsidiary foods instead of traditional meals and cereals they were used to. When all failed, there was the recourse to technology as an answer to the problem of hunger and scarcity that had been inherited from the British in 1947. So this is, in some senses, some part of it is a prehistory of the Green Revolution, how you actually did move towards the moment of the Green Revolution. And what has happened is that the success of the Green Revolution, the fact that India was able to actually conquer hunger at that point, has overshadowed these early attempts at management of food and hunger, which took place, from around 1946 to 1952. So we will see this, many of the initiatives of this period, however, are still with us in some form or the other. Next, I will flag a new understanding of food and nutrition that emerges at this moment by looking at a Hindi cookbook that I argue vernacularized this scientific lingo for the housewife in northern India, and there was actually a move away from a cultural to a technological understanding of food throughout here through compulsions of statecraft. And what we will have is a universal language of science which is being used to understand food. So, when India got independence, we were in the throes of famine and scarcity. Britain's extractive rule for close to 200 years had left the Indian economy in shambles, bequeathing to the new government a society burdened by acute food security resulting from prolonged mismanagement. We already had the partition, the famine in Bengal, and in fact, during the partition also took away food producing areas on the west and the east of the country. So after partition, Indian Union included 82% of the total population, but only 65% of the total wheat production and 68% of the total rice production. And so there was a very precarious situation between 1947 and 52, when there were a lot of, there was really a scare for scarcity, for hunger and famine. There were also questions of political legitimacy, a new government, which is coming, azadi mili hai, and that azadi is not letting you have azadi from hunger. It was a moment which was, all aspects, everybody that you read about in that period, from the interim government onwards, from 1946 onwards, we find that this is a constant challenge that the government is undertaking. So multiple strategies were adopted for food management between 46 and 52. From the time of interim government, Babu Rajendra Prasad was the Minister for Food in the interim government. He, in a 20-minute broadcast on September 23, 1946, he openly discussed the magnitude of the challenges faced by the interim government. In fact, on 15th August 1947, Prasad hoisted the tricolour at the Indian Council for Agricultural Research as Minister for Food. And in fact, he declared that our most pressing task would be to conquer the dreaded evil of hunger. Since production could not be increased overnight, it is a long haul. So the focus was on controlling consumption. And the government then imposed rationing to control consumption. People were asked to fast, to eat less in order to tide over the crisis. It was decided to continue wartime rationing due to scarcity of food. And if you see the next slide, you will find that this is just the way rationing was implemented in UP. And if you look at it, you will see, you can see what the kind of confusion that would happen, the kind of bureaucratic overreach that would happen if you have this kind of rationing which is implemented. In towns, everybody would get this much chatak of grain, this much chatak of rice, this much sugar, this much ghee, and these kept on changing. It is not even as if this was one standard. As and when food was available, these rules also kept on changing. So this was, obviously, there was a lot of confusion, and rationing was deeply resented. So for example, just to give an account, in 1948, there was a halwai, a Hiralal halwai. His house was raided, and there were extra 48 kgs of rice was found there, over and above the permissible limit, and he was arrested. He pleaded that there were 9 family members and 6 servants who worked in his shop, and that extra rice was for his servant who worked in the shop. He also was found to possess 200 kgs of atta, and he again pleaded that this is not wheat, which was rationed. This is corn, basically makai. None of it really helped him, and he was arrested for 6 months. He was fined 1,000 rupees then, and it was that was a big amount. And this you can if you go to the archives, you can find these stories ad infinitum, because so many people had to undergo this. On top of that, Mahatma Gandhi was deeply against rationing. He had been against the control of prices and rationing right from the beginning, and he believed in independent India. Centralization of foodstuff was ruinous. He held rationing to have very limited use, In his column in November 1947, Gandhi wrote that food controls have given rise to fraud, to suppression of truth, to intensification of the black market, and created an artificial scarcity. There was also opposition from business leaders who were concerned that rationing and controls were just initial steps towards socialist planning, which Nehru was trying to impose on everybody. Deferring to this widespread criticism, the government lifted all controls on food grains. So in December 1947, abruptly, all controls went away. Predictably, the result was profiteering, skyrocketing for food grain prices, and as prices in domestic markets surged, the reliance on imports went up. It became evident that private market was unable to fill the void left by dismantling of the state's procurement, pricing, and distribution machinery. Consequently, in less than a year, in September 1948, regulations on food were reinstated, and each province, in each province at the same level as they were in December 1947. So it was an 8-month period of decontrol. There's a lot of work here. I'm just skipping the rest of it, but it is a very, very, it is very instructive to read these accounts of rationing that were coming up, and there are a lot of new scholarship which is also working on it. With rationing, what was announced was austerity measures. So even with, if you did have access to rationed food, there was austerity to be observed. In 1949, the Food Ministers' Conference announced a slew of austerity measures. The number of guests at any party or ritual was limited to 24. It could go up to 50 in case of marriage or death. These guests could only be served one simple meal of one dal, one vegetable, one sweet dish, or one dal, two vegetables at the maximum. For non-vegetarian meals, you could have 3 out of 4 courses, obviously, could be meat or fish. Residential and commercial restaurants, establishments who were serving European food were prohibited from serving rice. Rice was really scarce. And in Indian restaurants also, it was stipulated that not more than 6 ounces of cereals will be allowed to a customer in a day. It included everything, whether you had rotis or rice or bhakri or whatever. 6 ounces of cereals was what could be served to one person. And this lead for austerity was taken up at the highest level. So the Prime Minister's Secretariat sent a letter on 12 December 1950 to the Home Ministry requesting that the simplest of meals, containing only the 3 required courses, be served in official receptions and dinners. However, they were also concerned with what they were eating. So the PM also advised, there's a note in that letter, that a simple meal need not be a bad meal. So they were slightly concerned about what would come to them. The austerity measures required the full weight of the government machinery to be implemented, starting with first and foremost an enumeration of residents of the non-ration towns and rural areas, the issue of austerity provisioning cards for distribution of food, grains, cloth, sugar, kerosene. It is little wonder that each one of these measures was also opposed and resented. Then comes here the next sort of thing in which this armory of how to manage food. This was a unique program called Miss a Meal, and what happened was, this was another way to control consumption. This was through moral exhortations of fasting to mitigate the adversity of fellow citizens, collectively through what came to be known as Miss a Meal program. In October, early as October 1947, a number of Indian leaders had met Gandhi over the grave food crisis that confronted the country. Among other things, Gandhi stressed the value of partial self-denial, saying that both Hindus and Muslims are used to fasting for religious reasons, and now they can easily do so for the sake of starving millions. So basically, you miss one meal a week. At a civil society level, Jagpravesh Chandra, who ultimately became the DCC president also in India, he was a Congress worker from Lahore. He had come to Delhi after partition, and he got together a host of civil society organizations, like the All India Harijan Sevak Sangh, Servants of India Society, refugee associations, All India Women's Conference, Hindu Mahasabha, every one of them. And he made everybody sign support to this Miss a Meal movement. And it was said that all Indians who could afford to give up one meal a week to do so for the cause of nation and the countrymen, the grain thus saved was to be contributed to a national fund. This would inculcate the national habit of uniting and striving jointly at the time of crisis and emergency. As explained by Jagpravesh Chandra, the movement had the potential to make up for 7% of India's estimated 10% food deficit, saving approximately 400 crores of rupees each year. Basically, the total sum of amount spent by the nation on 52 meals per person a year. Additionally, he said missing a meal would train people to control their palates, which would foster Gandhian ideals of self-discipline, enable the citizens to perform duties that entailed freedom and democracy. By 1950, Miss a Meal became a part of PM Nehru's radio address to the people. Over the radio, he appealed to Indians who could afford to help by giving up one meal a week and donating what had not been used to scarcity-stricken areas. And it caught on the imagination of the political class. It was endorsed by Babu Rajendra Prasad, who was now president, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. They all said we will all miss a meal every week. Some people like the Bombay chief minister, he said he would skip 2 meals a week. There were, of course, opposition and criticism of this. The Communist Party went on streets saying, of this fasting for the nation, this exhortation to miss a meal when there was no meal to be had is actually quite something. And in fact, later on, Nehru also wrote that, it didn't really, there were a lot of places where grains were collected, but the rationing officers did not know what to do with it. Because, it was making the numbers go awry. So basically, आधा grain सड़ गया कहीं पर, कुछ गया नहीं, and then it was taken away. So along with the negatives of rationing, austerity, and fasting, we find that there was a more positive aspect of food policy also that was being formulated. Hunger had to be challenged by the collective power of people just as they had battled colonial oppressors. This was to be done by scientific development planning with a political call for self-sufficiency in food, which people as foot soldiers of this food Swaraj. So just as they had learned new techniques of political participation, now they had to learn new techniques of food production and be open to new items of consumption. In an important radio address again to the nation, Nehru appealed every Indian to join this crusade for food production, telling them it is a war in which every citizen can be a soldier and serve his or her country. Amartya Sen, Georges, these people have alerted us to the many different ways of seeing hunger. And hunger can be caused by famine, by acute starvation, or by chronic insufficiency of nutrients. And it is here we find that this issue of chronic hunger and food deprivation in general, involving sustained nutritional deprivation on a persistent basis, was tackled. So it was said that this leads to manifold consequences of undernourishment, debilitation, fatigue, morbidity, and possible mortality, with obvious effects on human well-being and productivity. There were bureaus like government agencies like the Nutrition Bureau started, and now what we have is the ideas of population, food availability, and nutritional deficiency being talked about together. Okay, let me see. The population of the country was estimated at 397 million in 1950. It was likely to increase to 480 million by 66, which meant an increase of approximately 2%. And let me just cut these figures short. It was also said that in order to feed this additional population, the annual production needed to be raised by 20% in the next 5 to 6 years. Further, it was estimated that the food consumed by average Indian was nutritionally deficient, comprising a disproportionate ratio of carbohydrates, barely providing 1600 to 1900 calories. As against a minimum requirement of 65 grams of protein, an average person usually managed only 30 to 35 grams per day. This semi-starvation meant that the physical weaknesses are passed on for generations to come. We find that the transformation, not just increasing food production, but transformation of the diet of Indians is now being continually talked about by planners and scientists. And in fact, again, we have, Gandhi, from 1930s onward, Gandhi was writing a series of articles in his periodical Harijan, extolling the benefit of village diets. But he also noted that the village diets were themselves deficient in vitamins. So he exhorted the villagers to go back to traditional consumption of unpolished rice, whole wheat flour, gur, but he also said to include more green leaves, groundnut cake, soya bean, which was new, to make the Indian diet nutritionally complete. Radha Kamal Mukherjee, a professor at Lucknow University, noted the suboptimal level that the Indian population existed and tabulated a food deficiency of 12% for 12% of the population in a year of normal harvest. So there is this idea that you don't really need famine conditions for issues of food scarcity. Radhakamal Mukherjee advocated for systematic food and crop planning on a countrywide scale based on the science of economics, agriculture, and nutrition. He promoted a mixed diet based on several staples in place of rice and wheat, promoting beans, pulses, and edible roots as salutary for national health and invaluable insurance against the shortage of staples. So to combat this deficiency, what we had was, there was a push made for subsidiary foods. And throughout 1949 to 52, and there were two categories, subsidiary food and synthetic food. So subsidiary food, in fact, were those foods which could be grown quickly. So it was estimated that if substitute to staple cereals were grown in sufficient quantity, about 15% of the cereal demand would be replaced by these foods. To counter the fact that food differences were notoriously difficult to change, Nehru hoped that modern rational thinking would make people give up these prejudices and accept the change, both for dietary as well as for monetary reason. And he says, our food habits are not good. They are not balanced diet at all. They can be improved tremendously by certain changes. In fact, even the cost of food would come down. With these subsidiary foods and with the change of food habits, we can make a healthier nation. How are you going to have these subsidiary food and what are they? So the foundations of scientific development in independent India were propelled by a host of administrators and scientists. In this case, the work of S.S. Bhatnagar, Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, who was instrumental in setting up the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR. The Industrial Research Planning Committee appointed by the Council recommended the creation of a center dedicated to food research. Thus in early 1948, steps were taken to set up a Central Food Technological Research Institute. The Mysore government, you can see, look at the place where the Food Institute is coming up. The Mysore government offered the magnificent and beautifully maintained Cheluvamba mansion and with the attached 150 acres of land in December 1948. The task of converting this mansion into a research institute was given to the director, Dr. V. Subramaniam of IIS Bangalore, who promised that the Mysore laboratories would be able to make a distinct contribution towards national food deficit within a year, and they started producing a lot of food. So it was the CFTRI that initiated the concept of grain substitute in 1949, saying that our production is 60 million tons and our deficit is 6 million tons. This deficit can be made up either from 20 million acres of cereal or only 2 million acres of synthetic cereals. What are these synthetic cereals? If you look at the slide, you would find that this CFTRI started producing various substances like low-fat groundnut meal, which was 80% tapioca, 20% groundnut cake powder. There was something called tapioca macaroni. It was also then fashioned into macaroni like Italian macaroni like pieces, also fashioned into rice like grain. There was something called Mysore flour, an Indian multi-purpose food to take care of nutritional deficiencies. There was another pilot project which aimed at developing vegetable milk from groundnuts. This gave successful results. It was hoped that this would help in combating per capita milk shortage. Further, to specifically cater to the northern Indian states, which were wheat eating rather than rice eating, wheat was a combined neutro flour was developed, which was made up of 75% atta, wheat flour, and with 17% tapioca, 8% groundnut flour. The UP state government selected centers to initiate tapioca plantings. A pilot project was initiated in 3 districts of Uttar Pradesh to determine the acceptability of neutro flour, at least in lab conditions. Chapatis and puris prepared from this a blend of this mixed flour was found to be equally acceptable as those prepared from wheat flour. It was hoped that once this atta was accepted by people, the flour can be then prepared by local mills according to the standards of basically, and standardized and made available for marketing. The production of these, and there is a lot of, if you read the archival document newspapers from that time, there is a lot of push about this kind, these to add these food or to go on to eat these kinds of food in your daily lives. But the production of these foods was only the first challenge. The acceptability of these scientifically produced or fortified products was another matter. To make these products acceptable to the common person, the concept of agricultural extension was formulated. So in every agricultural university, you would have an agricultural extension department. An extension advisory committee was set up at the central government level, consisting of members of community development ministries, council of CSIR, etc. Journals such as Food Science and Khadya Vigyan in Hindi were published. In fact, in 1959, Khadya Vigyan had a circulation of approximately 15,000 copies, circulation 15,000, and it was distributed amongst various community development centers, schools, and colleges. Okay. Then there was another way in which these foods were supposed to be popularized. Women were deployed as comrades in the task of dietary transformation. An All India Women's Food Council was formed in 1951, mostly through the efforts of Leelavati Munshi. Leelavati Munshi was K. M. Munshi's wife, and K. Munshi was in 1950s the food minister. A task which he has written in his autobiography, he detested completely, because it was really very, very stressful. So she was there. Ranbanshi Devi was the president. She was the president's wife. Homi Talair Khan and Leela Job were prominent members. The aim towards changing food habits during this time of food scarcity was the aim of this All India Women's Food Council. The council tried to attain this objective through a chain of Annapurna cafeterias, which provided non-cereal, cheap, clean, and nutritious food, especially to the lower income groups. And in fact, this is why the Annapurna canteens were exempted from paying income tax. Two initial schemes for setting up these cafeterias in Bombay didn't work, and then the council successfully opened the Annapurna restaurant in Delhi in 1951. Along with this, the Annapurna cafes also took on the responsibility of providing nutritious food to school children. Some departmental canteens of government offices like the Planning Commission, National Archives, ICAR, Safdarjung Hospital, they were also offered to the Annapurnas. They usually called as Annapurnas only. There's no cafe, cafeteria after the first few in most documents. And they were supposed to provide cheap and clean service on a no profit, no loss basis. And you can see here, this is in 1954, Annapurna canteen is being inaugurated in Bombay. There is Leelavati Munshi at the Dadar Catering College in 1954, again with Morarji Desai. A series of exhibitions was organized in Bombay and Delhi demonstrating recipes without rice and wheat. Rajendra Prasad inaugurated the Delhi exhibition, where Leelavati Munshi contended that though the food problem had baffled the greatest of our men, women would no doubt find a solution, given that it was their province to handle food. Appealing to women as food ministers of the household, the AIWC continued to expand the Annapurna chain nationwide, establishing 32 branches by 1955. And it's actually interesting that this has almost completely been forgotten in scholarship, because this is where a lot of the midday meal and other kind of providing of cheap food to people, this was their originary moment, and this has actually not been looked. You usually go to Madras, but even the Madras experiment was a continuation of what was happening here. So we see that obviously by the time we come to the mid 1950s, 60s, there is a big, especially 60s, there's a big problem. The government revokes the tax exemption. Slowly the women are not able to manage the canteen, etc. With a host of problems, these canteens were one by one closed down. But between 47 to 52, what we have is that we have a corollary to the government policies on increasing agricultural productivity and import of food grains. We find this three-pronged strategy based mostly on civil society participation, which was put in place to deal with scarcity and famine. So grow more food, miss a meal, Annapurna canteens, these are all part of the same kind, investment in food that is happening. Side by side, a new science of nutrition is also introducing new ways of thinking about the value of food, and in fact the importance of particular food not only in preventing death but also in enhancing lives. So we now enter, it is happening side by side, the language of protein, vitamin and protective foods enters common vocabulary in India, spreading rapidly beyond the confines of laboratory science. And India managed to avoid famine at this point. It had to deal with chronic malnutrition. So the recourse to nutritional science, the attempt to create synthetic food, extracted food from its cultural moorings, and placed it in the realm of a pure commodity. That could be created in laboratories and controlled by the market. This disenchanted discourse, in fact, however, had to contend with the continued understanding of food within a biomoral discourse. This is not easy. It was, in my earlier presentation, I talked about cookbooks and how they were so resistant to any kind of change. India's nutritionists and planners were aware that nutritional science could somehow detach food from culture. They were keenly aware of cultural preferences and hierarchies, which is why, things like Nutraflor, it should taste like the rotis that you're eating. There were attempts to introduce wheat into South India because rice was really scarce. None of them took off. They gave seeds to farmers. Those experiments also fell flat. So they understood that there were cultural preferences, hierarchies, religious beliefs, and taboos usually shape people's food choices. That is the reason that the language of science deployed the notion of national moral economy. Which is why emphasizing that if the ability of the nation to feed its people was fundamental test of the nation's legitimacy, then the people also too had to nourish the nation, and by agreeing to transform their daily diets. So it was a two-way process. If you say our legitimacy is dependent upon the rulers are saying by providing food, then the citizens' legitimacy towards nationalism is also to agreeing to transform, to agreeing to be fellow soldiers in this whole narrative that is happening. In the next section, I want to talk about how was this knowledge vernacularized. This is very good to talk about what the government wants you to eat. But what happens? What is really happening? We know none of us are eating any of this now. We are not eating any, tapioca, etc., as a daily alternative. So this section, the next section, explores the relation between the discourse of technology and technological modernity and the traditional dietary practices in India. To do so, I again go back to a cookbook, which for me are always windows into the home at this point of time. Okay, this I've already talked about. You can see all these advertisements that had come out. In fact, there's a photograph which is not there, which is of Chyawanprash. The Chyawanprash advertisement is saying that, this is very good and this is etc., ancient, this, that, and it will increase vitamin C in your body. So even Chyawanprash now had to talk the language of vitamin C, and you will see all of them. If I sort of increase the size, you will see that there is similar kind of, the language of nutrition is being spoken about. This is, okay, I don't know. Kuch light ban kar de. To understand this transformative culinary moment, I use the concept of vernacular modernism. Vernacular modernism as a conceptual category emerged in scholarly efforts to democratize the term modern with respect to non-metropolitan cultural formations. Miriam Hansen has contended that the postmodernist challenge to modernism and modernity at large opened up a space for understanding modernism as a much wider, more diverse phenomena. And in fact, in a formulation, the term vernacular combines the dimension of the quotidian, of everyday usage, with connotations of discourse, etc. It has been suggested that modernism in India, was deeply implicated in the need to fashion a style for the modern as it was locally experienced. Thus, modernism in India was not imagined solely through Western import, but was born out of varied cultural constructions and processes of social and political identity formation, the formation of the pre-colonial period. As we talked about cookbooks, which alert us to the changing social world of urban India in 20th century, we had seen this happening in my earlier presentation. By 1950s, we find Hindi cookbooks, and these are really low-cost, ephemeral Hindi cookbooks, very difficult to find in libraries, etc. Koi tasveerein achhi nahi hai isme. They are not dealing with, elite cuisine. They do not have Nawabi cuisines. They don't have Awadh ki rasoi or etc. Kuch nahi. These are really very, 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 very low-cost, cheap publications that I deal with. So we find that there is this cookbook written by Rukmani Devi Bhargav, published in 1958 from Banaras, Uttar Pradesh. And here we find that it is also using this language of of food and nutrition. 3,000 copies were printed for this cookbook. And at the first glance, it looks like any other cookbook. You know, the preface is written by a Jyotishi, Rajesh Dixit. He's a scholar. He gives you this full, discourse about how food is important in Indian traditions, the Ayurvedic traditions, 6 ways of, eating, and when you should eat what, etc. All the things that I talked about in my last presentation. This is written there. But Rukmani Devi, when you open Rukmani Devi's own introduction, I hope you can see this. She completely circumvents this conventional understanding about Hindu foodways. We find the concerns of this cookbook are quite different from those espoused by its traditionalist preface writer. On the contrary, the author's introduction plainly states that the main purpose of this cookbook is to provide a detailed list of finest and nutritious food items that augment the human body's power and potential, keeping it healthy and increase its capacity for action. Quite astonishingly, Bhargav begins a treatise with this paragraph. Experts have compared the human body with the steam engine. Just as an engine requires coal and water, the human body depends on food. Both use oxygen in combination with food to generate energy. In both, oxygen produces heat by action. The engine converts this heat into steam, which powers the wheel and makes them go around. The body creates the energy to work, which in turn powers the muscles and is used for further actions. In both the steam engine and the body, waste materials are produced and are then discarded. Thus, neither can an engine work without coal and water, nor can the human body work without food. This is absolutely, I have the number of cookbooks that I've looked at, Hindi cookbooks, I have never found a statement like this. They all begin with placing food in biomoral, traditional, historical space. This kind of intervention I have not come across. So Bhargav goes on to present the human body as a fantastic, extraordinary machine that produces heat and energy. Indeed, the human body is superior to an engine as it can repair itself without which a machine cannot. Humans only notice the actions that the conscious exterior body performs, and do not give much thought to the numerous actions that go on within our body, the way the numerous fibers and cells are continually destroyed and regenerated. The food we digest enters our body fibers, combining with oxygen to produce heat and energy, forming the basis of human life. This is all quotation from Rukmani Devi Bhargav. Later on in the text, Bhargav elaborates that the basic task of food is to produce, this I have done already. Bhargav educates the readers on the intricacies of a different group of 6 components of a food. Usually it was, कि भोजन के 6 वो होते हैं. यहाँ पर she has completely new understanding. She says protein, mineral, water, carbohydrate, fats and vitamin. She has information about the constituent elements, the products they are found in, and their specific worth to the body. Considering that it was only in 1848 that all known vitamins were fully discovered, their structures identified and purification and synthesis accomplished, it is remarkable that this knowledge is the core element of a Hindi cookbook published a decade later. It is only that you can see what is, this is why I find this so interesting. The extensive outline of Pak Ratnagar given above brings home the point that it was not just a new language, but a completely novel understanding of food and cuisine that was being employed. Nowhere do we find Bhargav reverting back to Hindu food and cuisine as it was understood in earlier cookbooks from the same region, or referring to similar cuisine. It appears as if the writer had totally dismissed the inherited philosophies of cuisine and embraced the scientific understanding of food and the human body, just as the young Indian nation had shrugged off traditional village-based conceptions of development, enthusiastically championing modern technology as a recipe for national progress. Where does the traditional come in? And you can see, again, as I said, these are very, very, basic images, basic cookbooks. Pak Ratnakar presents even traditional recipes with a new understanding based on language of modernity. So, in fact, I've cut that section out here. If you look at the recipes themselves, you find the recipes are pretty similar to what was there in other Hindi cookbooks. Exactly what is eaten in domestic kitchens of UP. But the way she presents those recipes is through a language of vitamins and nutrition, etc. So we find that here, modernity, as we know, modernity in India has seldom meant a blind copying of Western techniques and technologies. Rather, a fascinating process of resistance, adoption, and adaptation emerges. The contrary pulls can easily be witnessed in the domestic advice peddled by Park Ratnakar. So, for example, she has this thing about dining etiquette. So, in dining etiquette, as you can see from these pictures, these are the only places where the pictures are there. There are no pictures throughout, except that when she has to visually show कि भाई ऐसे होना चाहिए आपका खाना खाने की जगह. 5 minutes, yeah. So, we find that Park Ratnakar advises European-style dining etiquette to an extent. Food is set on tables which are tastefully covered with tablecloths, set with English cutlery. In one image, a wine bottle is also there, fluted glasses are present. The breakfast table is illustrated as laid in Western style with the spread including fruit juice in a glass with a stirrer and a lemon decoration, salt and pepper stand, egg on toast, etc. On the other hand, the image of the lunch looks, Indian. And in fact, not only is the food served in thali with small bowls all around, there's a glass for drinking water and a traditional, if you look at the side, traditional lota continues to be used as a water jug. Similarly, the image of the kitchen is an amalgam of modern and traditional. The arrangements of the utensil and condiments in the spice box with a cupboard of provision is very forward-looking. Every cookbook is telling you, you should have this kind of domestic arrangement, sari cheezein aise nahi rehni chahiye, almari honi chahiye, etc., etc. All of that is there. But the stove used is an iron angeethi, which is itself actually a step forward from the mud chulha. And again, the section I've excised out from this is about cook stoves. Because angeethi is a very, very important thing. Chulhas were stationary. Chulhas were the center of your hearth. All rules of purity and pollution were around the chulha. Angeethi could be taken anywhere. And in households where, for example, in households where, within quotes, some members wanted to eat meat, the angeethis were taken on the terrace, whatever, to cook meat. They basically allowed the kitchen and culinary practice to go beyond the kitchen. Okay. So, where was I? Yeah. In fact, the text also mentioned that, other than the angeethi, you can use an electric stove or a heater, a tandoor, cooker, and also the only injunction is do not cook rotis on a kerosene stove. Because, exactly. So, in other places, especially when giving recipes for cakes and biscuits, she also talks about a bijli ki bhatti, which is an electric oven, which is now coming in. Refrigerators are also mentioned. Cooking, however, is still to be done sitting. You can see the stove is placed on the ground and not on a side slab with a pidha or a low stool for the cook. So it's again, which is what I call, there's a vernacularization that is happening here. The vernacularization of global modernity is constructed through a novel articulation of scientific understanding of traditional cuisine. This emergent culinary idiom is expressed through a new vocabulary of nourishment. And in fact, we see what is happening here is that this new vocabulary of nourishment in science, which is underlining the superiority of good wholesome food through its nutritional values rather than its cultural significations. By looking at traditional cooking from the perspective of nutrition and health, Rukmani Devi's Park Ratnakar anticipated the success of later food technologists like Thangam Philip, whose book Modern Cookery, published in 1965, became the benchmark for cooking techniques for caterers and restaurants. Thangam Philip, in fact, I will just take one more minute. Thangam Philip was the best known of India's women nutritionists in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, she was educated at Lady Irwin College, then she went to Sri Lanka, she even went to US. In 1950s, she accepted the invitation of the Ministry of Agriculture, returned to India to manage one of the Annapurna canteens. And to serve, which were basically, her brief was to serve and popularize non-cereal based meals, especially for the middle class people. In 1954, as Annapurna cafes folded up, she became the first principal of the Institute of Hotel Management, Catering, Technology and Applied Nutrition. It was called the Dadar Catering College in Bombay. And she also ultimately ended there. She was there for many years, close to 2 decades. She's also been awarded a Padam Shri. Thangam Philip's Modern Cookery, Volume 1 and 2 are one of India's most prestigious and encyclopedic books on cookery, which have proved to be an invaluable reference and guides to students and professionals in the catering industry. The foreword to Philip's exhausted book was penned by C. Subramaniam, who was the Minister for Food and Agriculture in Government of India, and who praised Philip's scientific methods of cooking, planning of meals and improvement in the sense of taste, with the new sense of taste and flavor. This is the last slide. So if you look at these, she curates some meals in her book. The illustrations in Miss Philip's Modern Cookery, the menus curated by her, possibly depict the originary moment when standard Indian cuisine as we know it, as when you go out and, if you go out of India, you find the standard Indian cuisine as we know it was created, or curated, I should say. The first image on the inside cover shows dahi bada, tomato, mahasa, nargisi, kofta curry, potato basket, please don't feel very hungry, tandoori fish, satpura parathas, dal salad, tandoori naan, tandoori chicken, sheikh kebab, Hussaini kebab, coconut sweets, decorated savory cakes, etc. Which is what basically, if you go out, if you go to an Indian embassy thing, this is the kind of Indian cuisine that you would have. Philip's luncheon menus, both vegetarian and non-vegetarian, were curated by picking and choosing the most loved and rich recipes from different regions of India. And bringing together, also, remember, this is, there is also the austerity drives, people should eat whatever. So to bringing together the spirit of austerity and the spirit of nutritional science, she also listed the menu on the side, what was called the low-cost balanced menu. The salad bowl nature of this cuisine, crafted by and for the professionally mobile middle class, was disseminated through aspirational magazines like Femina and Women's Weekly, through elite hotel menus like Ashoka and the Taj, and through the menus of national airlines. Thangam Philip was actually, a consultant to Air India and Indian Airlines there. This recipe repertoire was very different in orientation and method from the Hindi cookbooks we have encountered in the study. Though curated from many homely recipes, there was nothing domestic or vernacular about Thangam Philip's cuisine. Instead, it was made for showcasing India and her vast culinary repertoire to the world. So I conclude by, the middle of the 20th century saw an immense drive towards collection and collation of data about food. Bulletins were prepared by the Government of India. Government of India noted weekly statistics about the availability or scarcity of food items, the fluctuations of price, prediction of crops, regional stocks of grain, rationing, etc. The purpose of generating such data by national and international agencies, foundations, the Ford Foundation was now working here, was to aim to quantify and manage India's food supply. This endeavor was part of a broader worldwide phenomena where statistics and specialists could buttress policy making. Food was now not understood within the specific domain of culture, but through a universal language of science and compulsions of statecraft. Further, we get a glimpse into the beginnings of a change in consumption practices and domesticity that sociologists have noted for the later decades, especially from the 1970s onwards. It is clear that an impetus for cookbooks like Pak Ratnakar or Modern Cookery was the new notion of novelty and diversity of taste. No longer was virtuosity in the kitchen based upon the mastery of classic caste and region-specific cuisine. Versatility became the crucial determinant of good cooking. A good cook is one who regularly attempts to make dishes and serves a variety of foods from different cultural traditions. At the same time, it was said, as Grahini, the Hindu woman must still protect the sanctity of the kitchen by ensuring that while the boundaries of acceptable food practices are stretched, they are not broken. Matching independent India's identification with scientific progress, while also remaining traditionally moored, cookbooks and domestic kitchens strove to participate in the construction of the new self-image of this modern nation. They became sites for the articulation of the familiar tension, how to reframe the traditional within the modern. Thank you.